Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Bom dia! Está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nosso convidado é o sul-africano Jonis Alasow. Ele é coordenador do secretariado do Pan-Africanism Today, organização que se dedica a fortalecer e unificar as lutas populares no continente africano. Antes de começar a entrevista, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes de nosso canal no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa da sua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência e nossa receita publicitária. Como essa entrevista foi previamente gravada, infelizmente não poderemos apresentar as perguntas de nossos internautas. Good morning, Mr. Alasow. An honor to have your presence at 20 Minutes International. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Hello, Breno. Hello to you and your viewers. It's very exciting to be here.
Mr. Alasow, South Africa is only a few years away from its 30 years of government by the African National Congress, the ANC, put an end to the apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela, on May 10th, 1994, took office as President of the Republic after heading the ANC since 1991. What kind of society has been built in this almost 30 years, Mr. Alasow?
Great. I think that's an excellent first question for a couple of reasons. But I think the first thing I want to start with in answering your question is to say that we should not shy away from the kind of society that was replaced in 1994. The truth of the matter is that apartheid was a really brutal life for most people in this country. It was dehumanizing people. I know many of us, and I think this, as the South African people, we owe a great debt to the world for having paid close attention to trying to understand what kind of society people were living in, but also mobilizing on all corners to try and usher in a more egalitarian and a more fair and a more free society in South Africa. So I think to start off with, the democratic breakthrough of 1994 is an extremely important moment in the history of this country in its road to full liberation. But with that said, I think it is important, and I think it's unfortunate that there has been an explicit attempt led by the ANC government, but also the white monopoly capital that props it up, to make sure that the view of the country of South Africa that the international community has today is one that pretends that there has been drastic changes in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. There's multiple examples of this, but the truth of the matter is that for the most part, if you today are living in wealth and have a dignified life and you have a job, your parents and your great-grandparents and so forth will have had the same. Similarly, if today you are living in squalor, you are living very much in a similar kind of environment that your parents and their parents will have lived in. So the truth of the matter is, whilst it was important for us to have the ability to raise a new flag in South Africa, it was important for us to have the ability to vote, to have the theoretical ability to go to all the beaches and to sit on benches and to be able to do away with the really brutal and dehumanizing system that was apartheid and before that colonialism. The truth is that the country that we are living in today is one where the white monopoly capital continues to control the economy. Black and African labor, and I'm happy to explain a little bit more about why I've used this phrase of Black and African labor, continues to be super exploited. And if in some instances, things have even gotten worse. So today we are sitting here having a conversation across the Atlantic Ocean where 74% of people who are constituting youth are unemployed. So of all the young people in this country, 3 out of 4 currently do not have a job and also have no prospects for a job in the foreseeable future. So the society we live in sadly continues to be one that is characterized as one of poverty, one of inequality, and one of mass unemployment. So the South Africa of today is one that is, if you want to put it in the nicest possible way, a liberation or a freedom that has not yet been concluded. But I think as realistic viewers of the situation here, we should say that it's not yet been concluded passively, but rather that the vision of a South Africa for all who live in it, a South Africa as defined by the Freedom Charter, which is a South Africa that belongs to all its people, is a South Africa that remains a far reality, and that the ANC government has led us into a neoliberal country governed by austerity measures, governed by effectively a continuation of the work that has been started by the colonial regimes, followed by the apartheid government, really at the expense of South Africa's people and its wealth, rather than for it.
Let me ask you a historical question. How does how has ANC appeared and developed to this day? Is it still the grand coalition of anti-racist, progressive, and socialist groups in the country?
So I mean, the ANC is formed in 1912. And really, it is formed as an elite project. So it is among the kind of like higher strata of Black and African society that the party is formed. And it is formed for the purposes really of kind of lobbying for reforms within the colonial administration. So it's about having kind of families such as the ones that actually many of the early ANC leaders were part of, be able to do things like own property, do things like accumulate some wealth. So I think the first thing that's important to note is that the ANC was not born as a liberation movement. It was born as a kind of like a lobby group for the interests of African elites at the time. And I think, for example, in 1930, the ANC was an explicitly anti-communist organization. So what we see today, and I'll come to that in a minute, where we have a kind of like, and even towards the later years of apartheid, where you have a collaboration and a kind of broad front against apartheid, which includes communists, includes the trade unions and so forth. The ANC itself was not born out of that kind of legacy. And it's only in the 1950s, after the National Party comes into power in 1948, that in the Youth League of the ANC, there is a recognition that the kind of strategy and tactics and the approaches that have been taken up until then are really not working. And therefore, there's a need to take up a more radical program that incorporates some of the demands that the working class in South Africa would have. And it's at this point that the ANC then launches things like the Defiance campaign. It's at this point that it is starting to really question the foundations, the economic foundations upon which apartheid is built. Apartheid is an economic system before all else. It's about institutionalizing the way in which you are able to super exploit the labor of a certain section of the country, and you are able to use that in the mines in order to generate super profit. So I think the economic system was propped up, and the ANC recognized that there's a need to kind of broaden its objectives beyond the objectives that are kind of about winning concessions and winning small seats at the table, and rather to say we need to really overthrow this kind of racist system. But then I deliberately am connecting here the kind of racism of apartheid with it as a policy of accumulation. And I think this is an important point to note, because as it kind of develops, and it develops into the period of the kind of the Rivonia trial, where we see even before that, in fact, we see the banning of the ANC, we see the banning of the Communist Party, we see a treason trial, we see a very famous Nelson Mandela make an important speech from the docks before he is sent off to life imprisonment. He's defended in that trial by a prominent member of the South African Communist Party. But throughout this period, the ANC is kind of like learning that in order to really build momentum, there's a multitude of things that is necessary. And it's in this throughout the 70s when the pressures, throughout this in the 70s and the 80s, that the ANC is kind of like recognizing a need to expand its strategy and tactics. And in order to be able to build the power, it needs to adopt an agenda that is going to respond to the needs of the people. So the Freedom Charter drawn up in Kliptown in 1955 is an example of a kind of, it's not a socialist document, but it envisions a society that has elements of socialism within it. And it is that society which then, because it is that vision that allows the ANC to become a broad church. In other words, to not have a single ideology, but to have a single kind of enemy that it is fighting against, which pulls in all those who are fighting for a democratic breakthrough in this country. So I think that the kind of the victory against apartheid, unlike the kind of like propaganda that we hear from the ANC itself, is the consequence of various things, including international pressure from friends all over the world who insisted that this system is inhumane and must end. It includes a mass mobilization of the forces in this country under the banner of a united democratic movement, which included the students from 1976 who were fighting against Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. It includes the legacy of the Black consciousness movement, of women's organizations, of trade unions, etc. And it is that group that made South Africa ungovernable, not the ANC leaders in prison, not necessarily the ANC leaders in exile. So the process of winning freedom in this country, the point I'm trying to make is this was not the victory won by the ANC. It is the victory that, of course, the ANC became the face of, but it was the victory of the South African people, hand in hand with progressive people, with the working class all over the world. And I think importantly, what has happened and what I'm describing about the post-1994 South Africa, that victory became one that was effectively co-opted as a victory of the ANC, and they were able then to yield that in order to introduce things like GEAR in 1996, which is effectively a neoliberal program of belt tightening and austerity measures. I'll pause there in case I go on too long.
But is it correct to affirm that between the 60s and the 90s, early 90s, ANC was led by socialist groups, by the left wing?
I would say that because there was an agreement within mainly the Communist Party to say that as a matter of strategy and tactics, the way in which we are going to fight for a revolution in South Africa means that we have to support this nationalist party, which is the ANC. And it is through the fact that many of the top leaders of the Communist Party were members of the ANC or were leading in the ANC, and there was a lot of crossover between the two, that the ANC as an organization was able to kind of advance an agenda and put questions on the table. Chris Hani, one of the heroes of the South African liberation struggle, is a leader of the South African Communist Party. Sadly, he is gunned down, but the moment in which he's gunned down is one where he has walked out of this negotiation with capital. So I think it is, I agree with your statement, but I think it's important to say that it is the ANC did not have some kind of internal leftism. It was leftism imposed on it.
The key issue was the decision of the Communist Party to get in the ANC and activate the ANC as a liberation movement.
Correct.
That's perfect. Mr. Alasow, the National Party responsible for introducing apartheid became the new National Party in 1997 and dissolved itself in 2005, becoming part of the African National Congress itself. Does this fact represent a process, a diluting process in the ANC's identity?
Look, yes, the short answer. But I also think it is within the ANC itself is not above class struggle. And therefore, within the ANC, the interests that want to protect and safeguard private property, the accumulation of wealth, etc., versus the interests that are representing a faction that wants to win over wealth for the majority, wants to kind of make sure that South Africa, again, citing the Freedom Charter, belongs in the most literal sense of the word to all who live in it. That tension existed for always within the ANC. So when I mentioned Chris Hani, someone who walks out of the negotiations that are led by Cyril Ramaphosa at the time about the settlement of how can we find a compromise between allowing black people the right to vote without handing over the economy and the interests, the economic interests in this country to them. So this tension exists. It exists long before, in the 1970s, the biggest capitalists in the country started negotiating with the ANC, long before the National Party did. So the truth is that in the Thabo Mbeki was meeting with the Oppenheimers in periods where the ANC itself and its kind of identity, once this breakthrough would happen, was in question. And really the dissolving of the new National Party into the ANC is, I think, one of the biggest testaments to the ANC's economic identity and its policy identity, in the sense that ultimately you can be a Afrikaner capitalist who owns an enormous set of farms in South Africa, and you are guaranteed under the ANC that that will not be touched. Why would you care that people are now voting for their own people if your interests remain protected?
As far as I understand your statement, Mr. Alasow, the apartheid regime has been formally overcome, but maintaining a predatory capitalism that allowed the emergence of a black bourgeoisie, but keeping the immense mass of the poor, mostly black, in a situation of intense social exclusion. That's correct. I have synthesized your point of view.
Absolutely, but I would say that the only thing about apartheid that has really ended is the kind of like legal system, in the sense that it is now no longer legal for me to say that my children can only go to certain types of schools, etc. In real terms, though, we still see white schools, we still see hospitals that are meant for the rich. And you are right, there has been a degree to which there have been black people that have been able to break into this rank of the bourgeoisie. But for the most part, this is firstly, this is largely a negligible amount. But most importantly, the working class, the poor, the exploited, the suffering, the oppressed, the landless of today remain the same as the group that existed before. So structurally and socially, the apartheid continues in terms of how our cities are designed, who goes to our schools, how healthcare is attributed to people. So I would push back a little bit on your synthesis to say, really, this is a slight legal change. Practically, the pillars and the foundations have not been tampered with.
Who are the South African ruling classes? The black bourgeoisie, the old white bourgeoisie, or a collision between these two social factions?
So I think an interesting way of responding to that question is through the kind of factionalism that is currently on display within the ANC. So within the ANC, there is the kind of what is called the kleptocratic faction led by Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma was a president of South Africa for 2 terms. He was recalled towards the end, but ultimately presided over an administration where people loyal to him effectively were given an opportunity to make use of state infrastructure in order to enrich themselves. So this is the kind of one faction within the ANC. Within the ruling party, there are members of its national leadership which are currently suspended as a result of their, of course, corruption, but politically as a result of their kind of loyalty to what, let's call it, the Zuma faction. Then there is a faction led by Cyril Ramaphosa. I mean, those familiar with his biography, he was
Current president of the country.
Yes, he was a leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. In the 1990s, led the team that negotiated with the National Party in the settlement that led to the elections in April 1994. Then moved into business, became a multi-billionaire in this country, and returned back to politics recently. He remains one of the richest men in this country. His brother-in-law, in fact, Patrice Motsepe, is the richest man in this country. And policies such as Black economic empowerment have been used very effectively by people like Cyril Ramaphosa to effectively become a kind of get a seat at the table of white monopoly capital in this country. So these factions, they work together. They sponsored Ramaphosa's election campaign, etc. So who are the elites and who are the ruling classes? There's currently a tension among them and between the kind of group that sees the state as a vehicle for self-enrichment and the group that seeks to effectively continue a pure form of the economy that existed pre-1994. The truth that I think is most interesting for me and for those of us interested in freedom is that the voice, the interests of the masses of the working class are absolutely unrepresented in this discussion. So there is no section within the ANC today that is advancing an agenda that is concerned with emancipation in the sense that it was defined by the people who laid down their lives to win that 1994 democratic breakthrough.
Which are the nowadays role of two important anti-apartheid forces like the Communist Party and the union, the COSATU?
COSATU. So the post 1990, in the period where really the fight against apartheid was heating up and reaching its climax. In the 1980s, when we saw a kind of period where the country was ungovernable and so forth, the three organizations, ANC, South African Communist Party, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, who had really been fighting the same fight all this time, agreed to form an alliance. And in that, this is what we call the tripartite alliance, which has existed since 1994. And the view was that even once the question of state power has been resolved in the interest of the ANC, it is necessary for the communists and the trade unions to continue to be working together with the ANC, and because that will allow the most effective government. Now, this is a perfectly useful idea as long as the ANC is advancing the same, as long as all three are pulling in the same direction. So this was the objective in 1994. Today, after almost 30 years of this alliance, which has been going through various bits and pieces, the ANC is pushing the same neoliberal policies that you in Brazil will be very, very familiar with. The policies that say, let's disinvest, let's not make the government, the state and its machinery must be hollowed out. The only role that the state has is the protection of private capital through police, through the military, etc. So this is the line that has been adopted by the ANC. It has not really deviated from it, at least since 1996. So this agenda of neoliberalism has been the agenda of the ANC. Unfortunately, the alliance has remained intact. And what has happened is that high-ranking officials of COSATU or the SACP have found themselves given ministerial positions. The Minister of Higher Education, the ministers of various important portfolios in government are taken by general secretaries of the South African Communist Party or former leaders of COSATU or even current leaders. So this point of being in bed with a bourgeois state has effectively made these organizations impotent. There are very important comrades sitting in these organizations who still maintain that there is a revolutionary path to be followed. But this is very difficult to do when you have taken a seat at the table and you are not using that seat to popularize the views and the interests of the masses, but rather using it to make sure that you continue to live the lavish lifestyle of a minister. So sadly, this tripartite alliance and specifically this policy of deploying key cadre into government positions has created a situation where COSATU and the SACP, when you read their documents, should really be leading us in the streets against these neoliberal policies, but are finding themselves complicit.
Understand. How would you explain, Mr. Alasow, the recent protests in the country? Circumstantial events or exhaustion signs of the model established by the ANC?
So a little bit of both, but mainly I think it's important to understand the context within which this happened. I've mentioned the unemployment rate in South Africa. Unfortunately, South Africa has had a 29% unemployment rate for some time. In the first quarter of 2021, this went up to a 32% unemployment rate. We are today, and especially the youth, are most affected. Black people most affected. Black people have an unemployment rate of over 50%. Young people have an unemployment rate of 74%. That's the first element that I think we need to understand in order to make sense of what has recently unfolded. The second thing that is important is, and this links back to the comments I was making about the neoliberal policies, Ramaphosa's government has led a campaign about introducing a minimum wage, which translates to about 3,500 Rand per month. The average basket of food for an average household costs 4,200 Rand a month. So the minimum wage that is being introduced and which is being used in order to try and demobilize workers who are organized and in order to super exploit those who are not organized is not even able to ensure that people have food in their stomachs. I'm excluding here the ability to send your children to school and to pay for medical bills and so forth, much of which remains private if you want quality in this country. So the second element that I think is important is the question of poverty and hunger in this country. 30.4 million South Africans are not guaranteed a plate of food at the end of each day. So this food insecurity question, the poverty question, the unemployment rates, and the last point I want to make is that, and I know that this has always been a very cynical competition between South Africa and Brazil about who's the most unequal country. We tend to act as though there's some kind of Olympics of the highest Gini coefficient and we want to win this. Now, unfortunately, South Africa has at least had one of the highest rates of inequality in any country. So I think the point that so this is to kind of like paint the landscape before we start talking about things like looting and criminality and pretend that poor hungry people who walked through a broken window to take maize meal home are people that aren't you and me. The truth of the matter is there was the arrest of Jacob Zuma. I think it was on the 7th of July, which some small number of people mobilized around. They attempted to mobilize people, but they sparked something. So what I would term, what people have in the bourgeois media here called looting.
The protests were triggered by the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma.
It sparked it, yes. Some people started to mobilize, but tens of thousands of people who were hungry, who were food insecure, who did not have prospects of employment, joined in and used an opportunity to get groceries, which they have no other way of getting. So I really think that I would term what happened here not even food riots, it's a food rebellion which happened. And really, and it's unfortunate, in the bourgeois media, both in South Africa and internationally, the question of looting and Jacob Zuma, this is the two main stories. The main story here is that hungry people needed to take power into their own hands and appropriate food at a time where they had no opportunity of getting this in any other way. So that's why I said yes and no to both of you, to the kind of like elements that you put on the table. There is an element of the factionalism within the ANC playing itself out. But the only reason it is able to play itself out in the way it did is because of the massive social crisis that we are confronted by in this country, which has nothing to people were interviewed in Durban, which was hardest hit by this, and the question was, why are you doing this? Without a fail, with 50 people were asked this question, not a single one said this has anything to do with Jacob Zuma. Not a single one cared about whether Zuma is in jail or not. They were saying, well, what must I do? I have nothing at home. People were going to the shop where the window was broken to take things, so I joined them. Frankly, I consider this I'm not encouraging this as a matter of principle, but I understand the logic of why people who have been impoverished over
People
generations
were
had to push this.
starving.
Absolutely.
Mr. Alasow, in negotiations after his unconditional release in 1990, Nelson Mandela agreed to exchange the end of the apartheid regime for a pact that would protect the civil and economic rights of the Afrikaner minority, as well as renounce any prospect of non-capitalist development. Can the problems that today affect the working classes of South Africa be partially attributed to this negotiation?
Absolutely. I mean, the very nature of a negotiation is that it's a give and take. Neither party should leave with everything. So you have to give something. I mean, this is yesterday, the energy sector in South Africa declared that they are in a deadlock, and there's a very high likelihood that over the coming days, we're going to see a mass strike in this country. Now, this is as a result of ineffective negotiations. Really, what is at stake, though, is the extent to whichever side of that table you find yourself on, you have the power to push through the most important gains you hope to make. So it, yes, can absolutely be drawn back to this, where concessions were made, concessions around the principles of private property, concessions around the redistribution of wealth, the concessions around the reparations for the immense suffering that was imposed on people, not just for the duration of the apartheid government led by the National Party, but for 400 years of colonialism. So there were absolutely concessions made at this point, and absolutely many in the ANC were quite happy to make these concessions in exchange for the ability to see their faces on a ballot paper. That being said, that the task, and perhaps we can talk more about this, of the working class, of the majority, is to mobilize and fight for these gains, because clearly this is not something we can outsource to say we are going to hand over power to the ANC and it will then use that power to fight in our interest, demonstrated to be false time and time again. And the question of how can we remobilize in the way that we were in the 80s towards advancing the interests of the majority is going to be the question we confronted by, with or without the ANC.
Mr. Alasow, why so many concessions? Why so much compromise? Was it a miscalculation by Mandela, or himself, or was turning to a new liberalism perspective?
So, as I mentioned, my view is that that neoliberal perspective has existed within the ANC almost since day one. And absolutely, I think there are various elements that contributed to why did we compromise as much as we did. A part of it is really just, and I think this is often underplayed, apartheid was so brutal that something that seems minuscule, like the ability to vote every 5 years and the ability to go to whatever beach you want, is a massive victory to the vast majority in this country. So I think the first point is that perhaps as the people's movements and organizations that existed in the country, we were celebrating the possibility of an end to this inhumane system, but were perhaps not making sure that the key elements that were propping it up do not follow us into the new South Africa in inverted commas. That's one element of it. The other element of it is that the ANC's policy explicitly has been to demobilize people. Effectively, those who were on the streets making the country ungovernable in the 80s were told, okay, go home now, we've got this, we will take it over from here. And really, the principle of popular accountability, not every 5 years, but accountability in the day to day to your constituency, is something that was done away with in this period of negotiation. And then here, I think this is something that was actively pushed by the interests that were behind the neoliberal wing of the ANC, both internally and externally. But it was also, to some extent, allowed by many of the people in this country who was correctly celebrating an important moment. I think what has been unfortunate is that, and again, it took in some places up until the 16th of August, which is this month of 2012, where this very same ANC government set the police to go and shoot mine workers in the back in a time reminiscent of the Sharpeville massacre that many of us see as something that could never repeat itself. Um, in 2012, to realize that this is not a government for the people or by the people. So really, there is a need for us to kind of break new grounds in building organizations that are able to advance and continue the dream that people like Hani were assassinated for in the 1990s.
Do you believe that the recent protests are influenced by foreign powers, as the government claims, in yet another episode of hybrid war?
I I would be interested to know what foreign governments who already have managed to ensure that South Africa walks the path of neoliberalism would have any interest in trying to upset what is an excellent arrangement of the export of key mineral resources here, not much government spending on key areas that benefit the people. So my short answer is no. I do not think that they were foreign instigators. This is a common trope that is used, especially in relation to African people, where, well, these are black people, they couldn't have just gone to the streets by themselves. Of course, there must be some kind of third force involved. And that third force then becomes a list of 12 instigators or internal instigators. It becomes foreign governments. And we are not willing to contend with the fact that people went into the streets because they wanted to and they needed to go into the streets in the context of the failures of an ANC-led government.
Do you believe that a left-wing alternative to the ANC is possible? One that could form an electoral majority and open a new path for the country and for the working classes in South Africa?
Excellent and important question, because it's easy to sit here and run through the list of criticisms. I think the task is precisely this one. I think there are a couple of things that should give us hope. In 2013, after the Marikana massacre I've made reference to already, the largest trade union in the country had a special national congress which resolved that the ANC-led alliance has no ability to deliver an emancipated future to not only the constituency of the union itself, but to the people of South Africa at large. And as a result, eventually ended up being kicked out because they were not willing to tread this line and have moved out of this ANC alliance and are building a series of important processes that, at least I will hope, culminate in precisely what you are talking about. So I think that's one thing that gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope is that, again, I mentioned that 2012 is when many people woke up, but fortunately and unfortunately, the ANC-led government and its executive wing of the police and the military and private security and so forth have not waited long after 1994 to start criminalizing the poor in this country. So people who had been economically marginalized have been created to be those on the periphery, had been the first ones to feel the consequences, and I mean the consequences here in a negative sense, of ANC rule. So in 2005, following countless uh, dehumanizing attacks on the poor by the ANC-led government, a shack dwellers movement called Abahlali Basimjondolo was formed. And this movement has grown to 100,000 members. It has been able to celebrate its 15th anniversary in a few 1 year ago. And so the point I'm trying to make is that not only have we seen in the last month or two that the discontent, the popular discontent in this country is rising. COVID is accelerating an already crisis ridden society, crises ranging from gender based violence to mass poverty and unemployment and so forth. But also, there are formations of the working class that are organizing themselves, that are building momentum, and that are building momentum to the point where the time is absolutely coming where there will have to be a home for the working class that can contest power and that is able to, and I mean the working class here, all those South Africans who don't own the means of production in this country, to really contest power and to become that alternative in real terms to an ANC that really works either for itself or works for capital.
Would be possible to attract the Communist Party, the COSATUs, or part of the COSATUs, or even groups from ANC to this kind of leftist coalition? Do you think is it possible?
I think so. I mentioned that the ANC itself was not above class struggle throughout its history, and within it was contested, and and that remains the case today. There are contestations. The unions that form part of COSATU, the finance minister named Tito Mboweni has made a series of highly unpopular decisions, which effectively are the voluntary approach of an approach of voluntary austerity measures. Many African countries, we know this, throughout the 70s and 80s, were forced by the Bretton Woods Institutes into these structural adjustment programs. We in South Africa, led by the ANC and led by specifically people like Trevor Manuel or Tito Mboweni, have voluntarily adopted this path of austerity measures. And this is something that is blatantly against the interests of, for example, public sector workers who are often unionized within COSATU, but who were told last year that we are going to decrease your salaries by 7% in the middle of a pandemic. So absolutely, the kind of coalition of progressive left forces that are willing to take forward a revolutionary agenda will find very interested ears among those even who have up until now still held out faith that there is some kind of redeeming quality within the ANC-led alliance.
Could the rightist Democratic Alliance recover the South African government in the near future?
My view is no, for at least two reasons. One is that the DA itself is internally massively fragmented, and it's fragmented, unfortunately, along various forms of conservatism, some more racist than others. In other words, there was a leader of the ANC named Musi Maimane, effectively pushed out by a faction within the DA that is concerned with making sure that this remains the party not just of white interests, but also white people. Then there's, of course, the kind of the right wing neoliberal policies of the DA, which incidentally are not much different to those of the ANC that we see today. That being said, so my first reason is that the internal fragmentation and challenges within the DA means that it doesn't, in and of itself, offer a serious alternative. It also simply has had a policy of appealing to votes on racial lines. And in South Africa, the vast majority of people are just not white. Who does seem to, tomorrow we are anticipating a march led by what is called the economic freedom fighters, people who have instrumentalized the economic frustrations of South Africa's people under a proto-fascist nationalist view and are intending to march in a historically Indian community in order to really try to use a form of neo-fascist ultra-leftism
A
to
black
try and drum
fascism?
up support. Pardon?
Black fascism, Alasow?
That fascism is an economic system and an
I
economic approach
understand,
of
but
so
as far as
yes,
I know, this party is led by black people, isn't it?
Julius Malema, absolutely, and have used the narratives of, unfortunately, they have taken advantage of the failed Rainbow Nation experiment of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela to try and advance an approach that is highly divisive, whether to other African people in the form of xenophobia, whether to other black people, such as people who would have historically been classified as colored or Indian, and have ultimately adopted an approach that has no desire to take seriously and build seriously something that is going to be democratic, that is going to be popular, and that is going to be progressive and leftist, but rather have a kind of populist agenda under a kind of right-wing reality and left-wing rhetoric.
I understand. And are they growing up in electoral and social
In
terms?
recent elections, yes. And like I've mentioned, I mean, again, the truth in South Africa is that the discontent is real. The suffering, the misery, the squalor, these are not imagined things. So the EFF, whether it was through in the student movements that have kind of proliferated throughout the period around 2015, were able to very quickly instrumentalize on any form of discontent, whether people are becoming chauvinist and having challenges with, or whether their day-to-day struggles are manifesting in xenophobia, whether they are manifesting in food rebellions, or whether they are manifesting in the call for free and decolonized education, the EFF has been extremely effective at appearing at those moments. The first person to give a speech in Marikana after the massacre was Julius Malema. So the ability to really understand the difficulties that people are faced with is something that is being used to popularize this organization named the EFF. But we have not yet seen a realistic attempt to tackle the fundamental questions of poverty, and the counter question of private property, which continues to be the source of all this misery.
So nowadays we have a new liberal ANC, a rightist democratic alliance, a new fascist Mandema's party, and what you advocate is that a leftist alternative should be built against these other three groups. That's the idea?
No, absolutely. So I think I mentioned, I think, or you mentioned as part of the introduction of some of the work that I do outside of this interview, there is ultimately the time where, not just in South Africa, but historically throughout the various parts of the continent and the world, when the masses of people are organized well and able to hold whatever instrument that is being used to contest power to account, those are the times where the most sincere and meaningful breakthroughs have been made in terms of improving people's lives. So therefore, I would argue that there's really two things that are important, and one cannot go without the other. The first is that building and strengthening real popular organizations, trade unions, social movements, women's organizations, community organizations, landless workers, etc. There is no limit to this group, but to really build and strengthen those formations of the working class that are taking up the bread and butter issues in the day-to-day that workers are and the unemployed and the people of South Africa are confronted by. I think this is an immediate and urgent task. And then parallel to this, and I mentioned the process of the break of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa from the ANC-led alliance in 2013. Part of that included a kind of roadmap that the union itself developed, which said that the working class needs a democratic and independent trade union. It also needs an independent and democratic and revolutionary, in the most literal sense, trade union federation, which led in 2017 to the formation of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, which is a federation that has 700,000 members, which is the second biggest federation in the country after COSATU, which is tasked with ensuring that the struggle of workers, those who have jobs, are taken forward. This also, the 2013 Congress of the Union led to the formation of a united front, which is tasked with connecting the struggles of the shop floor and the community, and also ultimately in 2019 led to the formation of a Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party. Now, this party is very young and it has work to do, but the history and the trajectory that it comes from suggests to me that parallel to the strengthening of independent democratic organizations where the power of the workers is allowed to express itself, the construction and strengthening of an instrument such as the SRWP in order to ensure that the ANC does not continue to butcher the South African people is an important task.
Mr. Alasow, two other historical questions. First, do you think that the assassination of Chris Hani, the former leader of the Communist Party, helped to change South Africa history? Was it relevant to this 30 years process?
Absolutely. You will recall that shortly before his assassination, Chris Hani walked out of these negotiations and said that I did not cross rivers and watch my comrades die in struggles to come and settle for anything less than freedom. And I think it wasn't that was not to say that he was against negotiations, but it was to your earlier question of did we need to concede this much? And the answer of Chris Hani was absolutely not. We did not need to concede as much as we did. So he walked out of those, and he was mobilizing to say, guys, we cannot spend all that blood. I mean, Solomon Mahlangu, a young boy, is killed by the apartheid state, and he's killed for what? For only the ability to tick every 5 years, or is he killed for his people to have a qualitatively better life? So this was Chris Hani's line, and this was what Chris Hani was pushing. His assassination, unrelated to at least the dynamics within the ANC and the Communist Party, it was on the following his assassination that the actual date for the elections was set. So it was through that assassination, accidental to the negotiations as it may have been, that it was possible for this compromise way forward to have been accepted. So my view is absolutely, had Chris Hani not been assassinated, we might have seen at least significantly less meaningful concessions made in the 1990s.
Just to explain to our viewers, Chris Hani was one of the most important communist leaders in South Africa. He has been assassinated in 1992. 1922, and he was the main military leader in the MK, or say in the armored arm of the African National Congress, and he was a very popular leader in South Africa after apartheid collapse. That's it. A good explanation about
Yes,
him.
good summary. I would like to add also, I think there's someone that often gets kind of overlooked in this conversation. And we've had a lot of discussion here, and there's a lot of male names that get dropped. But the person whom we don't acknowledge enough is Winnie Mandela. The kind of explanation, both locally and internationally, of who she was is some kind of a weird ultra radical who eventually had to be removed from the ANC leadership precisely because she was just doing ridiculous things. The truth of the matter is that the other person who was pushing the same line as Chris Hani was Winnie Mandela. And her fallout with the ANC, her fallout with Mandela, her fallout with a lot of what has happened since, because she had both the privilege and the unfortunate condition of having to live into post-apartheid South Africa, was very much that of Chris Hani, and to say that we really conceded way too much. So I think Winnie Mandela, similar to Hani, is someone whose ostracization from the ruling party and from government post 1994 is really goes hand in hand with this kind of adoption of a continuation of apartheid rather than a break from it.
The second historical question I'd like to ask you: why South Africa is the world champion in sexual violence against women?
Yes. So this is another a sad trophy that we hold in South Africa. I think there is a series of contributing factors to this. One is that the levels of patriarchy and misogyny that have existed in South African society have often uncritically been adopted by the ruling elites. So I'm not sure if your viewers will be aware, Jacob Zuma, just before becoming president, was accused of rape. And there was credible evidence that he was a rapist. And he was defended by various groups, including the Women's League of the ANC itself. At the trial, the woman who accused him was ostracized from not only the public but from society at large. Similarly, a minister, I think it was 2 years ago, was forced to resign after assaulting a woman in a nightclub. I'm using these as examples to demonstrate that this is a issue that the elites themselves and the public opinion has not adequately dealt with. So I think that's one contributing factor. Another contributing factor is also just, and especially this femicide and the abuse to women and children. Again, the sad reality, and I think it's difficult to paint this picture from a computer, but the conditions that people are confronted by, I think living in the brutality of the South African economy, not just today, but throughout its history. Men were taken from the entire migrant labor system as established to say that men must leave the homelands, the Bantustans, which since 1913, only 13% of the land is available to Black people. They must leave that. They must come and work in the mines where they are only paid enough to socially reproduce themselves. The woman must continue to effectively produce the next generation of workers in the homelands themselves. So when I speak of super exploitation, it's not a kind of propaganda. It's literally the way in which the economy is structured, is that the reason that the South African gold mines are so much deeper than anywhere else in the world is because you were able to dig deeper with less labor power, in the sense of how much money you have to pay. So the entire economy is built on separating men from women, exploiting them historically, and then unleashing them back into their societies where they come from, where until today, the dehumanization of the South African worker, male and female is something that then plays itself out in the domestic sphere, as we know. So I think these are some of the contributing factors, but also the fact that the role that the police and the military here play is if anything, to enable that. Women who want to report something are going to be attacked more by the police for what they were wearing and how they were dressed and how they carried themselves than to try and advance the kind of objectives set out in the Constitution. So I bit all over the place, but I really think there is a multitude of social and economic contributing and historical factors that contribute to this. But it's of course something that I think it's important to say on this platform. One of the tasks of this progressive left front that we say is necessary is to tackle these questions, not one day when we get to power, but today as we are seeing it around us.
Mr. Alasow, we're finishing this exciting interview, and I would like to ask two questions that I always ask to our guests. What book have you read or are reading during the pandemic, and would you like to point out to our viewers? And which series or movie could you suggest to those who are following us?
Great. Okay, so I'll start with the last one because that's the shorter answer. I have two children, both are under 5, so my opportunities to watch television are severely limited to children's films, and I will recommend nature documentaries, these Blue Planet or David Attenborough things, because they are most tolerable for grown-ups. So I think in terms of television, there's not much. I think there are a couple of films, I don't know how familiar we are with the South African reality, that I think are going to be useful to watch. One is there's a film called Dear Mandela, produced from the vantage point of the shack dwellers movement, Abahlali baseMjondolo, which I mentioned, which gives helpful insights into the kind of reality of South Africa in the context of our incomplete revolution and emancipation process. So that's, I think, a useful documentary to watch. Similarly, Miners Shot Down, unfortunately, I mean, it's a tragic documentary to watch, but it's really good to get an understanding of what does it mean in 2012 to have to ask the kind of questions that needed to be asked in the 1960s and 70s. So that I think the films or the documentaries I would recommend that I've been watching. Books, I've been reading a series of, in fact, I think, and this is maybe a bit not everyone's cup of tea, to me, the COVID-19 pandemic internationally has really elevated some of the contradictions that have already existed in society. So for me, reading Marx's Capital in this time has been most interesting, because some of the things that might have been difficult to understand 10 years ago now, unfortunately, are all too obvious. I think also the other thing, again, this is in terms of international geopolitics, there's a book written by Edgar Snow on the Chinese Revolution, just because of this kind of new dynamic developing between the US and China. Reading Red Star Over China has been insightful. But I do read some things for fun. I read Golden House by Salman Rushdie. I've been reading some novels that I like to read from time to time, just because it can't only be politics. Yeah, I'll stop there. It's all I can think of.
Mr. Jonis Alasow, thank you once again for your kindness in accepting our invitation to this conversation, which has been certainly very interesting and exciting for our viewers, and especially for me.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nosso convidado foi Jonis Alasow, um dos dirigentes da organização Pan-Africanism Today. E o nosso tema foi a situação política da África do Sul. Obrigado a todos e a todas pela audiência. Um grande abraço e até a próxima oportunidade.
Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos, deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal, você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.